You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, as promised, we said, when the offseason is rolling along and the rumors start to fly, why not dive in and do some great crossover content and get a bit of a sense of it? The hot topic, certainly, for the Brooklyn Nets is that Shams Charania report that they've come to a bit of a head when it comes to contract discussions. Probably likely that he remains a Brooklyn Net, but what if? What if, my friends? And that's why, of course, we bring in Gavin Schall from the Locked On Knicks podcast, because one of those what-if teams is the New York Knicks. Before we dive in, good to see you again, man. We've caught up a few times before, but how have you been in similar waters, an unsatisfied season for both teams in the New York area?
Yeah, I think it's this weird thing, right? Because the season itself, I think that the nadir might have been that 20-point blown lead against the Brooklyn Nets without any of their big three. There were certainly a lot of low moments, certainly a lot of frustrations with Tom Thibodeau, but with a little bit of time to breathe, a little bit of separation from the season, a lot of good stuff came out of it for the New York Knicks, particularly RJ Barrett really emerging as a consistent 20-plus point per game scorer down the stretch. Emmanuel Quickley and Obi Toppin putting together a fantastic couple of final weeks of the season. Recent draft picks like Quentin Grimes really flashing and looking like they'll be long-term contributors. So the Knicks in some ways are in the best position they've been in about 20 years, but there's always that internal pressure, right? When are they actually going to turn the corner? What's the ceiling of the current team? How do they eventually find a star? So all those questions remain, and it's this weird situation where there's almost this cautious optimism around the Knicks, while with the Nets, like still objectively, as long as Kevin Durant is on the roster, they're in a better situation than the Knicks are. But there's this pressure. How do we maximize it? And now I don't know, Adam, you could confirm this more than I could. Is this slipping away from us a little bit when we seemingly had you flash back a year ago from now, this situation where it looked like they were going to rip off 3 out of the next 5 titles or something like that?
Yeah, man, life comes at you fast, as Ferris Bueller would say, right? Like it's one of those things, depending on where you were on the timeline for the Brooklyn Nets, things have looked a lot brighter, and arguably they can still be very bright here, right? You make the trade, obviously, with the 76ers, you get back Ben Simmons, if he's going to be healthy, and if you retain Kyrie Irving and have Kevin Durant, all of a sudden it's a different version of what you thought you were going to have, but you have some of these young pieces. You mentioned that blown lead for the Knicks happens to be that Cam Thomas was a young rookie with a couple of nice plays in there along the way for the Brooklyn Nets. So that's what's fascinating about this offseason and the decision around standing pat versus maybe shifting directions. And now for Brooklyn, that's a much more seismic move. But on the Knicks side of it, there are so many positive things. And Quentin Grimes even mentioned in there, he was one of the guys in the draft that I liked for the Brooklyn Nets to target potentially. So I thought he was a really good pickup for them. But with so much young talent, RJ Barrett, Obi Toppin, all these young players, you still end up having the disappointment that is Julius Randle. From a Knicks perspective, are you guys in the spot where you say, okay, we have the young nucleus, we don't want to rock that boat, and maybe we have to just kind of ride out whatever Julius Randle is going to be? Or do you think young talent, how can we maximize their value right now on the open market? And that's, I think, where this at least notion or suggestion of, if Kyrie Irving's out there, what does that mean? And what would you be willing to throw at a scenario like that? Philosophically, where do you think the Knicks should be versus maybe where they are?
I think it's so tricky, right? Because there's never going to be, and we keep saying this on our podcast, there's never going to be that perfect star available, right? Because those guys don't become available, or when they do, it's a freakish thing. Like LeBron wants to go back home to Cleveland, or LeBron wants to leave Cleveland for Miami. But outside of that,
is a perfect star.
Oh, you know what? Adam, you got me. What do you guys want? 4 first-round picks, 5?
Thank you. God,
yeah,
make it easy.
Yeah, someone sane finally. No. Yeah, like the guys the Knicks have been talking about, Zion Williamson, right? Who maybe now isn't available anymore, but someone with this like very scary weight issue and injury issue, right? Or Donovan Mitchell, who you question the ceiling there, and is he worth the price, and are you winning with that kind of defense? And then with Kyrie, we sort of all know what the questions are, and where I'm at is, I mean, this is blown up now in 3 straight locations. Like, why would the Knicks be any different? And if I'm trading for Kyrie Irving, I think it's as the final piece of a championship puzzle, where I'm saying to myself, look, this team is going to be so overwhelmingly good that all the other BS is just sort of irrelevant. And honestly, if James Harden and Kyrie hadn't gotten hurt in 2021, that would have been true. Like all the off-court stuff wouldn't have mattered. And of course, this season, the vaccination stuff still would have affected them. But if Harden was still Harden and he was content being on that team and just being the second or third guy and playing the role that he was sort of given, I think they would have won the championship this year. So it's all kind of irrelevant when you have that level of talent. Unfortunately for the New York Knicks, they're not in that situation, right? Kyrie doesn't make them a championship contender. He might not even make them a 50-win team, even if he's playing every game, even if I don't like to use the phrase best behavior with an adult man, but even if he's sort of like the best version of himself in terms of the off the court stuff, like, I don't think the Knicks are winning a title with him. So that's where I'm at. Where I think they're actually at is, hey, if we can sign this guy outright without giving up anything significant in terms of assets. And to be clear, the Knicks are going to have to give up something to get Kyrie Irving because they're going to have to attach picks to get off some of their negative contracts. I think to them that kind of talent risk is a go, especially given that if it doesn't work out and it blows up in your face, you could potentially deal him to the next team, whether it's the Clippers or the Lakers or someone else. But personally, I'm okay sort of skipping the Kyrie Irving crazy train.
Okay, so I mean I want to ask just a couple of the mechanics of like, the untouchables potentially in a trade with the Nets, etc. But is the Julius Randle, is that piece of it what prevents you from saying, oh, going all in on Kyrie makes sense? If this is Julius Randle 2 seasons ago, you say, well, adding in Kyrie Irving and then you'd be projecting the emergence of RJ Barrett, but certainly you'd say, oh, but Julius Randle's ready to be the elite number 2. Fast forward another season later, you go, that was probably the outlier. This is probably him getting a little bit back to the regressing back to the mean. And seismically, because this is the thing I always said philosophically about the Knicks and why after that big season off of Julius Randle, the playoff appearance, I said, just stand pat. Don't do anything crazy. And I think they at least marginally did by going and getting Kemba Walker. It was, you don't need it. I get what you think he can be for you, but you're better off developing the young talent. Stay the course with what you have currently. It doesn't really derail them by too much, but how important was the evolution of Julius Randle as a New York Knick to the thinking that this organization has?
No, I think it's a great question, right? Because if Julius, if he had replicated that season, he was second team All NBA again, then I mean, you're again, maybe not quite in terms of the baseline talent of the Lakers with the LeBron and Anthony Davis or the Clippers with the Kawhi and Paul George, but you can kind of talk yourself into it saying like, look, this goes right. Maybe we're in the Eastern Conference Finals. And for the Knicks, obviously that would be a seismic achievement because they haven't been there in over 2 decades. So that changes your calculus. And now Julius is a guy, at least in my mind, even if it was for no value back, I would prefer not to have on the team next year. And I think he's an aggregate negative. And that is obviously a massive, massive, massive drop down from someone who was considered one of the 10 best players in basketball, or at least someone who had one of the 10 best seasons in basketball 2 years ago. So I think it's a fantastic point. And maybe the Kemba stuff is a little bit of a cautionary tale in regards to Kyrie too. And I thought Kemba was almost, obviously the upside with Kyrie is so much higher at this point, but Kemba was interesting in the sense that it wasn't a high risk move until Tom Thibodeau made it a high risk move. They were paying the guy $16 million for 2 years. And because of that, you could have bailed out after 10 games and said, this isn't working. They sort of did that, but then they brought him back. And to your point, it derailed their entire season. With Kyrie, if you're giving him a 5-year, $200+ million contract, you don't have that luxury of saying, oh, this isn't working out. Let's just bail. And to what I said earlier, maybe there's another team that wants him, or maybe 4 teams in where this just hasn't worked over and over and over again. Teams smarten up and say, you know what, it's not really worth it. And I guess I'd want to throw that back at you, Adam. Do you think Kyrie Irving is worth it for a team like the Knicks? I know it's hard to be objective here when we're talking about crosstown rivals, but if you were the New York Knicks and you could just sign Kyrie outright, would you go for it given what you guys have experienced on the Nets side of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. And we just had this conversation with Doug and I about, especially specifically this last year. And so much of the way we look at it is just, it feels like the default ways from the organization side of where are they? You're trying to build a championship team. So lack of availability and everything that goes on, this leads to a frustrating point where now you're trying to draw a little bit of this line around the contract and what you're willing to commit. But this is, Doug pointed out, rightfully so. Well, maybe from Kyrie Irving's perspective, just for this past year's set of circumstances, he goes, why didn't you back me? Right? Like I was there willing and ready to play half of the games, every single road game that I could. You chose not to let me do that out of desperation. after you saw things going sour with James Harden, all of a sudden was, well, our season's falling apart. Now we'll sacrifice whatever stand we were taking there. So there's a little bit of that you can talk about. But as you've mentioned throughout, there are more than one set of circumstances where Kyrie Irving has been a little bit mercurial around what his interests are and how committed he's going to be. That being the case, though, and this is why I think when it comes to the Knicks, it's a little bit more interesting, because if you are, let's say, the Lakers, a very desperate team, well, that's why you want to be in on these talks, because you're trying to squeeze the last championship drop out of LeBron James, and you're right there. The Clippers are another team getting talked about. They can be right there, and there's a good package potentially to come back from that. For the Knicks, is Kyrie the missing piece to getting to X, right? What is the net gain that you're going to see on the Knicks side of it? I think there's probably a secondary move you want to make off of that, right? And I don't know what that name's going to look like, but you probably want to go out and say, if we're going to be stuck with Julius Randle, can we move some other money and bring in a number 2 and get Julius Randle to where he should be, the third best player on a team, right? And maybe RJ Barrett is already there as that elite number 2. So I think you probably ask, what is our ceiling if we go get Kyrie Irving? If the goal is to be competing for a top 4 seed again and thinking you have a shot to go to the conference finals, well, Kyrie Irving on the court is very much capable of doing that for you, right? He carried the Brooklyn Nets all by himself in his first season to a good record, some nice wins, some big games. If you want to win a title, then it might be a little bit, forest for the trees to say, let's commit this big money to him on the open market, knowing that we're still going to have to do something else. The Knicks do have money. Like, they have flexibility, though. They have assets. So you can rebuild this thing. I think it's just a matter of who else you think you would bring into that situation as well, and what the value to RJ Barrett, to Obi Toppin, to any of the young players. What is Kyrie Irving's value there? And obviously keeping him in a big major market. The business side of it, you're going to sell even more tickets. MSG doesn't have a hard time selling out, but there's marketability there too. So when I turn it back and ask, what would you be willing to give up for Kyrie Irving? It's funny that I think I get the spot that the Knicks are in. And we talked before on crossovers. I don't have any animosity towards the Knicks. I want them to do well. I want them to be a quality team. Adding Kyrie Irving to that team makes them better, and it makes them better in a significant way. I just don't know if is that championship better. And if that's the one move you're making, you'd have to say, well, what did we give up for it? So when you think about a trade, draft capital, okay, picks. You guys got a lot of them. That's fine. But when you look inside this roster, by the way, we've had fans say, yeah, sure, we'll take back RJ Barrett and we've immediately go, that's not how this works. RJ Barrett is not something that's on the table for the New York Knicks. Julius Randle certainly is, but that asks questions from the Nets side of where's the value there. Obi Toppin, I mean, is it only the Evan Fourniers, the Burks, the Kemba Walkers of the world from a player standpoint that the Knicks would be willing to put out there to get Kyrie Irving? Or would they be Obi Toppin? Can that be a name that gets discussed in here?
So again, from my perspective, I think I'm just out. I don't think I'm trading for Kyrie Irving. From a Knicks perspective, I think the market determines the price here, right? Because the Lakers don't have a trade to make here, right? Like they want Russell. Do you guys want Russell Westbrook?
Russell Westbrook and some picks in 2029.
Yeah, not really. I don't know if Kevin Durant is getting all excited about that. I think he's maybe retiring if that is the deal. But the Clippers, to your point, have a pretty good deal to offer, and a trade for them just makes so much more sense. So I think they would be more likely to again go in on something like that, whether it's like some combination of like a BJ Boston, a Norman Powell, and some of their like tertiary guys, Reggie Jackson, like players that you could throw in around Ben Simmons and Kevin Durant. And if you're the Brooklyn Nets, you could walk into next season and say, hey, we're not the overwhelming favorites we were a year ago, but this is a team that we can go to war with. Plus, we picked up some assets to maybe put together another trade down the road when you combine them with the 76ers deal. I know I'm avoiding your question because I don't know if the Knicks would want to top that. They could top that, right? They could say, hey, we'll throw you Emmanuel quickly. We'll throw you Obi Toppin. We'll throw you a ton of picks. But they don't mesh, I guess is the best way to phrase it, as trade partners in a great way, unless Brooklyn is interested in Julius Randle. And I can throw that back to you, Adam. I would assume no. I guess that situation, like with him playing off of Kevin Durant, is a little bit more interesting. And there's obviously quite a bit of shooting there with Seth Curry, with Patty Mills coming off the bench that maybe gives Randle a little bit more room to operate. But the big question with the Knicks the last year plus now has been, can Julius play as a number 2 if he's not going to shoot like a number 1? And he's been pretty unwilling to do that. Obviously, taking a backseat to Kevin Durant is very different from a psychological perspective than taking a backseat to RJ Barrett. But to me, if a deal were to be made, and I know that's almost weird because if you're trading for Kyrie, the idea is like you want to win now and you want to keep someone like Julius Randle. But in my mind, like I really wouldn't want those two on the court together. So I would be
that would be your first offer would be Julius Randle, and then
and I think it would be contingent on Brooklyn saying, hey, this is the highest ceiling player we are going to get back in a deal. If I'm the New York Knicks, I'm certainly not trading away any young pieces for Kyrie Irving. They might differ from me. They might say, hey, this is our chance to acquire a star. And to my previous point, there's no perfect star out there we're going to get anyways. So let's throw a first round pick. Let's throw Obi Toppin in, and then let's get Kyrie Irving in the building.
Yeah, and I think because Doug and I battered around Julius Randle, and I thought, on the one hand, you say, well, do I think, again, is he 2 years ago, Julius Randle? No, but what is the best version of Julius Randle as you move him down the pecking order of a team? Interestingly, from the Nets side of it, while you do have a lot of shooters and a lot of talent, taking Kyrie out of that mix and then putting in Julius Randle and knowing you have Ben Simmons, but Ben Simmons isn't a shooter. So Julius Randle's role, there could be a little bit more required of him, or where does he fit in as a puzzle piece? And oddly enough, I will say it's like, the Clippers, which we've talked about, a lot of the money or the players you come back, even talk about a Luke Kennard or a Terrence Mann has been thrown out there, and you say, well, look at the contracts too, right? Nothing is not too big of money, not too long term. So the Nets still maintain flexibility from a Julius Randle standpoint. Well, you're locked in, right? Player option in 2025 of almost $30 million. Like, that's probably as much of a hindrance as well. If Julius Randle was sitting on a 2-year deal remaining here, and it's a short term where you go, well, what's our worst case scenario? He probably looks as good as he has in the last few years because he's playing with Kevin Durant, and he's now a movable asset where we can continue to roll this thing over and try to find the right pieces and parts. But locked in as long as they are, maybe he's still tradable, but the age is starting to go further from being the young talent up and coming, and then the price point too. So I would take that back in it if this is what it came to. And I keep trying to offer this caveat to people that listen to the podcast. I just want Kyrie Irving to obviously be here. That's the best version of the team. But if it's over and done, I would consider, if that was one of the offers on the table, saying Julius Randle plus a couple of picks here. And maybe you say Julius Randle and an Obi Toppin. So we think we have a bright future there. I would explore it. I think the best offer is probably going to come from the Clippers if it came to that. But it's not the prettiest picture. And to your point, this is a trade scenario that I think would greatly benefit Kyrie staying where he probably wants to stay, close to home in New York, benefits the Knicks in the grand scheme of things, but isn't exactly this like perfect one-to-one solves the problems on both sides.
Yeah, I gotta throw this at you. How do you think Kyrie would handle a young team? I just read that it wasn't even a report or something. I mean, I guess it was a report in its own way. Stephen A. Smith mentioned on air, but like Kyrie holding his own practices after Steve Nash's practices finished. And I know that's one of a million things I could list from last year with Kyrie, right? But do you think this Knicks team that I would argue outside of Julius Randle is building, and it sucks to say that because Randle was such a big part of this. Like, again, you rewind a year, but I'd say outside of Julius Randle, building a really good culture, like even more so than the talent in their young nucleus. Like, I like the people that they have in the building, and all of these guys want to grind. All of these guys want to be great. All of them play pretty unselfishly. And on court, again, that's never the issue with Kyrie Irving, right? The guy's a basketball savant, a basketball genius. I think his game is going to age really well because the skill level is so high. But in this situation, you're basically doing something that has only happened once in his career when he was on the Boston Celtics, where he has his own team of really promising young players. That didn't work out well. He was not really a leader for those guys. And not to say, like, clearly, like, you watch him and Jason Tatum, they still like him. They respect him. I think everyone in the NBA respects him and is enticed with him. He's just from a skill level. Like, he's a hooper's hooper. Like, everyone loves his game. If he came into the Knicks, I think RJ Barrett would be starry-eyed the first day. I think Quentin Grimes, Emmanuel Quickly, Obi Toppin, those guys would be looking up to him. But Adam, is there any reasonable reason to think that would last and he would be a quote-unquote good mentor to those guys? Or is he someone who takes like that whole feel-good situation off track? And if you're the Knicks, you're basically stuck with a more talented version of what Julius Randle has turned into for them, but maybe even more devastating off the court.
Yeah. I think, like, as you mentioned, he's incredibly well respected. He's very well liked. He works hard as anyone on his game. When he came back from that long delay, he walked out there and instantly was right back on track. He looked like he was in the best shape of his career, physically or NBA by NBA standards, right? So there's no doubting or questioning what his commitment is to being prepared to play when he's on the court. I don't know if it would be that big of a disruption. I think, it's funny too, because you speak about culture, and that's something that we talked about a lot pre bringing in Kyrie and bringing in Kevin Durant, what the Brooklyn Nets were able to build. And that word and that importance inside of an organization is usually thrown around when you're building, right? And you're building up and you're trying to set that good foundation to be able to get the big star to want to come to that. So, Kyrie may not be that perfect player for that. I don't know I don't think he would hurt anything. The question would probably become, if I use the Brooklyn Nets era as the sample size, is Kyrie Irving fully committed to what he wants to accomplish on the basketball court? Because he can go out and get you 25 plus points a night and have a team be pretty good and go on a run of some kind in the playoffs, and maybe not ultimately matter if it's conference finals or NBA finals, right? So I think he can drive and motivate young players as good as anybody. I mean, the best thing for RJ Barrett is just to see what this dude is capable of, right? And he communicates with young players. He helps improve them on the sidelines, on the bench, in the game. I think it's about the big picture, long-term goal. Kyrie, obviously, being a locker room mentor is not the end game. It's helping a team win a championship. And that's probably the biggest question you would carry over. And you said it at the top, and I've mentioned this before. Every stop now, since his career started, the most recent team, at least to this point, has suffered the greatest at the hands of Kyrie Irving. It's not a judgment on Kyrie. It's just the reality of it. Now, that story can get changed. That narrative can shift here with Brooklyn. Comes back. They start winning a lot of ball games. They start going on deep playoff runs. Well, then all of a sudden, it immediately pivots. And this last year, it's going to fall by the wayside when we talk about historically. But if he leaves the Nets and goes to the Knicks or goes to the Clippers or goes to the Lakers, and a similar story follows, that can end up being his legacy. Like, his career narrative can end up being won a title very early in his career and then kind of became this enigma character that bounced around a lot and never was able to find a home and find consistent opportunities to win.
Yeah, and I think let's look back at that championship. I think it worked in Cleveland because he was younger and I don't know if maybe he didn't feel empowered to, again, literally run a practice after the head coach runs a practice, but that wasn't happening. And a big part of that was, of course, having LeBron there and having, the Richard Jeffersons, the Channing Frys, like all those vets that made it work. But to your point, the most important thing was it was the overwhelming talent of that team that they beat the 70-plus win Golden State Warriors in 2016. And that was because they had LeBron, who's the top 2 or 3 player ever. They had good role players. And Kyrie, when his role was just, hey, man, you just got to go out there and be great. Like, he can do that, which is why, I guess this is where I'll ultimately end my final point before throwing one more question your way. I just think he makes so much more sense on the Clippers or the Lakers, because that puts him back in that slot. And it's weird to me to some extent that it hasn't worked out on the Nets, because he was in that position where he wasn't the number one guy with Kevin Durant there. And yet I think maybe because Durant is just a little bit of a quieter guy, a little bit more of a floater, like he didn't feel that pressure to not be himself. Or maybe it's because him and Durant are so close. And again, all this stuff feels weird and uncomfortable to talk about because you're psychoanalyzing guys that ultimately we just don't know that much about. But that's sort of my instinct on what happened in Boston and now what's happened in Brooklyn. And I guess, speaking of Durant, that's where I'll end my final point. Do you think Kevin Durant is content with the future without Kyrie Irving on the Brooklyn Nets as of now?
Well, so the two quick points on the, sure. I think the biggest part about whether it's worked out or not, it's the sample size, right? And that's that piece about Kyrie goes to anywhere all of a sudden. And the reason why I bring it up is because go back to Boston the final year. He played 67 games and gave you 33 minutes and averaged 24 points, right? Like, the guy was doing it. He was knocking down 40% from on the arc as you run through the stats. He was giving you 7 assists, which is, a career high for him, right? Like, he was peak Kyrie Irving. Now, for whatever reasons, personal reasons he chose, like, they were there, the big spot, and he took the big shots, and it didn't go down in the playoffs, but they were right on the cusp of being able to be it, right? Like, think about right now, this past NBA Finals, you go, oh, Kyrie Irving could have been on this team with Jason Tatum and with Jaylen Brown, and they probably could win that chip, right? So
Adam, I want to throw out there. We cut back to that Bucks series though. It was weird, right? Like he wanted to guard Giannis. Like they really did self-destruct. So it's like,
listen,
yeah.
The microcosm of that, that series and being like, it's like you're seeing it unravel before your very eyes, right? And you very rarely get to see that in real time in an NBA game. So the point being is like the peak of Kyrie and what he can be, he's still one of the best. And that's where, again, this cloud of what we think about right now in this moment versus if you take a step back and you think about getting him on the court and the pure talent. Do I think Kevin Durant, to your question, is comfortable with it? We keep talking about this. Some people think like, hey, Kyrie's the reason that I came to Brooklyn. If Kyrie's not here, I'm not here. And obviously then it's just, hey, it's all over. Get everything you can get back. And we're back down to the studs. And Nets fans know what a dark path that can be. But Kevin Durant has also been someone who very much says like, it's not my job to build the team, to construct a roster, to make those decisions. At the very least, I think he would afford the organization the opportunity to say, Kyrie's gone, and here is what we're replacing him with. This is what this can look like with Ben Simmons going forward. And I think, you get the first half of the year, right? If it looks like it can work, fantastic. If not, trade deadline, that's it. I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to go join another team, and the Nets have to deal with the fallout from that. But I think Kevin Durant would at least say, make your case, right? Why this can work out. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to come to that, but he's shown to be the type of player and personality that seems willing to give the length to say, what, here's the rope. How far do you need me to let you go before it looks like we get ourselves on path? And if not, I'm happy to move on. But God, I hope it doesn't come to that. Let's just be clear, right? I initiated this conversation to find out what it could look like if Kyrie Irving wanted to no longer be a part of the Brooklyn Nets, or the Brooklyn Nets no longer wanted Kyrie. I don't want to know about the world where it isn't Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and Ben Simmons going forward here.
Adam, that's my job as a Knicks fan. It's to put the worst case scenario for the Nets out there. I have to do it. I got to. It's a responsibility.
Worst case scenario, Julius Randle demands the ball and refuses to pass to RJ Barrett in clutch moments, right? Listen, it can happen all around. Listen, I said this was going to be a 10 to 15 minute. It ended up going certainly a lot longer in a great way. Are you optimistic around where the Knicks are going into this season? They obviously didn't meet expectations this past year, and not a lot is going to change outside of your younger players are going to continue to get better. Now, maybe they're going to make some moves this offseason, but do we assume that, Julius Randle is going to be here, right? Because the value just isn't there right now to move him, and you don't have a commodity necessarily to replace him with 1-to-1. Are they just hoping that the youth develops and some things that didn't go so well last year, Julius Randle just plays a little bit better, fits in a little bit more smoothly, and they can get themselves back to those playoff conversations?
I think a lot of it is going to come down to draft night, where I don't know, that's probably tonight for those of you.
Can I ask you? Real quick. Sorry, because I didn't even get to that.
No, go ahead.
And this is somewhat pointless, but in our discussions, but they're talking about, maybe the Knicks want to try to get up in the draft there, try to get up to that top 4 selection. How willing? What's the cost going to be? Would they give up young talent to get up there to get that job done? Is that going to play a role in what the Knicks would be willing or possibly considering doing? You take Kyrie off the table, just other players around the league. Hey, if we can't trade up to get our key target, now all of a sudden we have we have this top 10 asset that maybe can turn into player X on the market. We know Bradley Beal opted out. He's probably just going to resign there. We've heard about Dame Lillard, right? Like other names where you'd say we can dangle a pretty attractive, asset in this year's draft class if it can accomplish X. Is it top 5 or bust for what they think they can construct?
Yeah,
getting that point guard, obviously.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very tenuous point for any Knicks fan right now, because there's this world where they go out and get the 4th pick and draft Jaden Ivey, right? And they're gonna have to give up a lot to do that. And inevitably, I'm gonna feel some pain if it's 3 first-round picks plus one of Obi Toppin or Emmanuel Quickley or Quentin Grimes. That's gonna suck on some level. On another level, I think Jaden Ivey would be the most promising player they brought in since Patrick Ewing, maybe. Like I would be more excited about him than when they drafted RJ Barrett. So, or I guess you could throw Kristaps Porzingis in that conversation as well. But that would be
didn't pan out, but at the time, right?
No, I mean there were flashes of brilliance there. I mean, when he's a 7'3" guy, 37-inch vertical leap, bombing threes, it looked pretty good for a while. But we don't have to. That's a darker red than anything we've talked about here today. So I'll skip that. But point being, there's a world where if they make that trade, it would be fantastic, because then they're sending a very clear message that, hey, we are investing in our youth. We are building a sustainable young core. If we have Jaden Ivey plus RJ Barrett plus 2 of Emmanuel Quickley and Obi Toppin, or 1 of Emmanuel Quickley and Obi Toppin, that's the most exciting young group of players, again, the Knicks have had since the early 90s. So that is thrilling, and I'm willing to ride with that team. I'm willing to see what that team can do, where they can go. It might not work out, but that's a swing that I'm far more than Kyrie Irving, I would want the New York Knicks to take. If they don't go down that path, things are just a little bit more nebulous, right? Because they're still caught in this identity crisis. Do they want to win now? Do they want to be this playoff team where Tom Thibodeau is still the coach, where Julius Randle is still the best player? Or are they going to do what they've avoided doing for years and are on the path of doing, which is building out a sustainable young core? Right now they have that. They have all these guys on the roster who look at the very least interesting. Even like Brooklyn Nets fans know about Jericho Sims, the way he was like flashing some verticality against Kevin Durant down the stretch of that game. Again, Quentin Grimes, I think, is someone who's going to be in the league for 12 years. I think Emmanuel Quickley could be like a top half of the league point guard. Eventually, Obi Toppin scoring, he averaging 30 plus points per game over the final 7 games of the season or so, or at least somewhere close to that. Like there's exciting stuff here. And personally, I want them to invest in that. Will they actually do it? I think that needs to be seen. If they can't trade into the top 4, there's a whole lot of rumors that they're going to go out and go after someone like Malcolm Brogdon. And there's a world where they just try to be the best team possible again next year. And honestly, I think that leaves them in the exact same position they are this year, a season from now, where they didn't play the young guys enough. And there's either barely a playoff team or not a playoff team at all, which is the last place you want to be in the NBA. So it's interesting, but I think there's a world where they have something very similar to what the Nets had before KD came in, before Kyrie came in. And as we've seen, you build that in the right market, like good stuff can happen after.
Yeah. It's so funny to be both optimistic and tentative when thinking about where the Knicks can go next. I always say it's good when both these teams are good in the city. It's good for those crosstown rivals. It's good for potential playoff matchups. Like everything is better if these two teams are going toe to toe. So hopefully, however it fleshes itself out, it's just going to be healthy, quality. Let's have everything break the right way for both teams, so we can be talking about having some crossover battles throughout the year. Gavin Schall, Locked On Knicks. If you don't know it, you should have. Go listen to him, obviously, and Alex over there covering them all season long. Great crossover conversation, man. I'm sure we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam. It's always a blast.